My name is Oliver, and I'm 35 years old. The day my father's will was read, I remember the air in the mahogany-paneled study felt impossibly thick, as if every unspoken thought and suppressed grief hung suspended, visible only to us, the family. Outside, the Seattle rain fell in a steady, monotonous rhythm against the large bay window, mirroring the dull ache in my chest. It had been 2 weeks since Dad passed, and the silence in the house, once filled with his booming laughter and the clatter of his morning coffee ritual, was deafening. I sat on the edge of an antique armchair, trying to appear composed, my gaze fixed on Mr. Henderson, Dad's longtime attorney, who meticulously cleared his throat before opening the heavy leather-bound folder. Opposite me, my older sister Clara sat, her usually vibrant face pale and drawn beneath her auburn hair. She was always the more expressive one, the one who wore her heart on her sleeve. Even now, before a single word of the will was uttered, she had been moving around the room, offering comforting hugs to our aunts, uncles, and cousins who had gathered. Her soft murmurs of, I know, resonated with genuine sorrow, a shared understanding of our collective loss. She hugged Aunt Beatrice, then Uncle Thomas, her embrace lingering a moment longer than necessary, as if trying to absorb their grief to lighten her own. I watched her, a knot forming in my stomach. She was always the golden child, the one destined to inherit Dad's legacy. Everyone in the room knew it, or at least, they assumed it. I certainly did. Mr. Henderson adjusted his spectacles, the parchment rustling faintly. He began with the preamble, the standard legal jargon about Dad's sound mind and body, and the distribution of smaller personal effects, watches, jewelry, minor shares. Clara nodded solemnly, her hand resting over her heart, her eyes occasionally meeting mine with a look of shared, albeit different, burdens. The air was charged with anticipation. Then, he cleared his throat once more, his voice dropping slightly. Now, regarding the primary assets, the family residence, the investment portfolios, and most significantly, Henderson Industries. A hush fell over the room, even Clara momentarily ceasing her quiet condolences, every ear strained forward, every breath held. This was it, the moment everyone had been waiting for, the moment that would define our futures and perhaps redraw the invisible lines of our family. I felt a cold dread, not for myself, but for the inevitable shift I knew was coming, one way or another. Mr. Henderson paused, his gaze sweeping over each of us, a practiced lawyer's solemnity on his face. He drew out the suspense, the rustle of papers amplifying the anticipation. Clara's breath hitched almost imperceptibly beside me, her posture stiff with expectation. I could feel a palpable sense of quiet confidence radiating from her, a belief in what was her due. Then, his voice, clear and resonant, cut through the quiet air. Regarding the future stewardship of Henderson Industries, he began, his eyes settling firmly on me, a direct, unwavering stare that made my heart lurch with a strange premonition. I braced myself, ready for the words that would confirm Clara's long-held destiny. It is the express wish of the deceased, Reginald Henderson, Mr. Henderson continued, his tone devoid of personal emotion, simply relaying the facts, that the entirety of Henderson Industries, including all its assets, liabilities, and intellectual properties, be bequeathed in full to my son, Oliver Henderson. My own name, spoken with such finality, echoed in the silent room, a foreign sound. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow, stripping the air from my lungs. A dizzying surge of disbelief washed over me, a sudden, immense weight settling onto my shoulders. It was like watching a movie of my own life, but the script had been entirely rewritten without my knowledge, and I was the bewildered protagonist. A collective gasp rippled through the room, a wave of stunned silence following in its wake. All eyes, which moments before had been on Mr. Henderson, now swiveled, first to me, then to Clara, then back to me, struggling to reconcile what they had heard. I saw Aunt Beatrice's hand fly to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Uncle Thomas shifted uneasily, his brow furrowed. And Clara? I finally turned to her, her vibrant face, so full of shared empathy moments ago, slowly drained of all color. Her lips, usually a soft rose, became a stark pale line. The subtle warmth that always seemed to emanate from her vanished, leaving behind an almost ghostly pallor. Her wide eyes, fixed on me, were no longer filled with sorrow, but with a profound, sickening disbelief. Her previous comforting gestures, her warm hugs, receded into an absurd memory against the stark reality now hanging between us. The air, once merely thick with grief, was now thick with betrayal, a silent accusation. Clara's hand, which had been resting delicately on her heart, now flew to her throat, a choke sound escaping her lips, half gasp, half sob. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, locked onto mine, but it wasn't recognition I saw there. It was as if I had transformed into a stranger, a ghost who had usurped her rightful place. The air vibrated with unspoken questions, with accusations that needed no words. Uncle Thomas cleared his throat, a loud, jarring sound in the sudden, profound quiet. Aunt Beatrice, ever the empathetic one, actually began to rise from her seat, a look of distressed concern on her face, before Mr. Henderson's quiet, firm voice cut through the burgeoning unrest. As per Mr. Henderson's final wishes, he continued, oblivious or perhaps deliberately ignoring the palpable shift in the room's emotional landscape. Detailed provisions have been made for Clara Henderson as well. He gestured to a separate, smaller file beside the main one, including a significant trust fund, the family vacation home in Aspen, and a generous allocation of shares in several diversified portfolios. His voice was calm, almost dismissive of the bombshell he had just dropped about the company. Clara didn't even flinch at the mention of her name or the assets. Her gaze remained fixed on me, unwavering, a mirror reflecting pure, unadulterated shock and, yes, a flicker of something sharp and cold, like splintered ice. I wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the chasm that had instantly opened between us, to explain that I was just as stunned, just as bewildered by this turn of events. But the words caught in my throat, choked by the weight of everyone's silent judgment. Cousin Sarah, usually so bubbly, looked down at her hands, her face unreadable. Mr. Henderson continued to drone on about the smaller bequests, the various charities, the legacy funds. His words became a muffled background hum, overshadowed by the roaring silence in my own ears and the piercing gaze of my sister. The betrayal wasn't mine. It was my father's, yet I was the one bearing the brunt of Clara's silent fury, her shattering dreams. Is there a mistake, Mr. Henderson?" It was Aunt Beatrice, her voice soft but steady, finally breaking the spell of silence that had fallen over the family. Her question hung in the air, a fragile thread stretched taut across the room. Mr. Henderson paused, looking up from his papers. "No, Aunt Beatrice," he replied, his tone polite but firm. "The will was meticulously drafted and reviewed. It is unequivocally clear." His gaze flickered to Clara, then to me, a hint of professional exasperation in his eyes. He seemed to want us all to simply accept it and move on, as if this were just another piece of paperwork. Clara still hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but the air around her felt charged, brittle, like glass about to shatter. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her with an almost ethereal paleness that made her usually warm features seem stark and angular. It was more than just disappointment. It was the look of someone whose entire identity, their future, had just been erased in a few spoken words. I could feel the uncomfortable weight of the family's collective gaze shift from her to me, a mix of pity for her and a silent, unasked question for me. What was I going to do? What would I say? Her eyes finally broke from mine, sweeping around the room, catching the sympathetic glances, the averted eyes, the general unease. A tremor ran through her, a barely perceptible shiver. Then, with a sudden, jerky movement, she pushed herself up from the armchair, the sudden scrape of chair legs against the hardwood floor echoing loudly in the tense quiet. Her breath hitched again, this time more audibly, a raw, wounded sound. Every head turned, every eye followed her as she took a single faltering step towards the door, her back ramrod straight. "Clara?" I managed to whisper, my voice hoarse, feeling a desperate need to reach out, to mitigate the irreparable damage that had just been inflicted. but the name caught in the air, unanswered. She didn't look back. Her shoulders, usually so relaxed and welcoming, were hunched, rigid with a pain I couldn't fathom. A pain I, inexplicably, was now responsible for. The door opened and closed with a soft click, leaving behind an even deeper silence, one filled with the echoes of shattered expectations and the heavy, unyielding presence of a newly defined, uncomfortable reality. The soft click of the door closing echoed in the sudden vacuum Clara left behind, a small sound that felt as loud as a gunshot. Mr. Henderson, bless his detached legal heart, seemed completely unfazed, already moving on to the next section of the will, detailing a significant endowment to Dad's old university. But the rest of us, the family, we were frozen. The air was no longer merely thick. It was suffocating, heavy with unspoken accusations and a shared palpable discomfort. I couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Cousin Sarah, who'd been looking down, now nervously fiddled with the cuff of her sweater. Aunt Beatrice, still half standing, slowly sank back into her seat, a deep, sorrowful sigh escaping her lips. Oliver, Uncle Thomas finally said, his voice unusually soft, breaking the heavy quiet. He cleared his throat again, a nervous habit. Son, are you all right? This is quite a surprise for everyone. His eyes held a mixture of pity for Clara and a genuine, if bewildered, concern for me. I felt a flush creep up my neck. How could I be all right? My world had just been irrevocably altered, and I'd just watched the last remnants of my relationship with my sister shatter before my very eyes. The weight of Henderson Industries felt like a crushing boulder on my chest, an unwanted crown of thorns. I don't know, Uncle. I managed to stammer, my voice raspy, a stark contrast to Mr. Henderson's steady drone. I'm as surprised as anyone, more so perhaps. The words felt hollow, inadequate. I knew they sounded like an excuse, a weak attempt to distance myself from the very thing that had just driven Clara from the room. A part of me wanted to run after her, to plead with her, to explain that I hadn't asked for this, that I didn't want it. Not if it meant losing her. But another part, a darker, more pragmatic voice, whispered about Dad's choice, his wishes, the immense responsibility that had just landed squarely on my inexperienced shoulders. Aunt Beatrice leaned forward, her gaze gentle, understanding. Your father, he always had his reasons, Oliver. We may not understand them now, but he was a wise man. Her words were meant to comfort, but they only deepened the perplexing mystery. Why me? Why not Clara, who had interned at the company every summer, who had always shadowed Dad, who had embraced the corporate world with an ease I could only marvel at? I had chosen a different path, a quieter, more solitary one, working in finance, far removed from the public eye and the industrial empire Dad had built. This sudden shift felt utterly alien. Perhaps we should take a short break? Mr. Henderson suggested, finally acknowledging the palpable tension, though his expression remained professionally neutral. There are just a few more minor provisions, but a moment to compose ourselves might be beneficial. He closed the folder with a decisive snap, placing it neatly on the table. The sound was a welcome punctuation mark, a signal that we could, for a moment, collectively breathe. No one spoke, but a few quiet coughs and shifts in seats broke the previous stillness. I could feel the family's eyes on me, some curious, some sympathetic, some, I imagined, still processing the sheer shock of it all. I stood up, needing to move, to escape the confines of the study, even for a moment. My legs felt strangely heavy, as if weighted down by the invisible burden of the company. I walked to the bay window, looking out at the relentless Seattle rain, now just a blur through my unfocused gaze. Henderson Industries. The name alone conjured images of towering factories, complex logistics, and thousands of employees, a sprawling beast I knew almost nothing about. How could Dad have entrusted it to me, when Clara was so clearly prepared, so perfectly suited for the role? It defied every expectation, every family narrative. Oliver, you know I'm here for you, no matter what, Cousin Sarah whispered, approaching me cautiously, her hand briefly touching my arm. Her eyes, usually sparkling with life, were clouded with genuine concern. This must be a lot for both you and Clara. Her sensitivity was a quiet balm, a small comfort in the whirlwind of my thoughts. I nodded, grateful for her understanding, even if it was incomplete. The truth was, I felt utterly alone in that moment, burdened by a legacy I never anticipated, and estranged from the one person I thought would always be my closest ally. "Thank you, Sarah," I managed, my voice still rough. The silence stretched between us, filled with the unspoken questions and the gaping hole Clara had left. I wondered where she was, what she was thinking. Was she pacing her room, tears streaming down her face? Or was she already plotting, seething with a quiet fury I couldn't yet comprehend? My father's will hadn't just distributed assets. It had redrawn the very map of our family, and I, unwillingly, had been made the cartographer of Clara's despair. After Sarah's quiet comfort, the silence in the study felt less like a shared grief and more like a collective indictment. Mr. Henderson, ever the professional automaton, cleared his throat once more, his voice a stark contrast to the emotional wreckage around him. "Now," he stated, his gaze sweeping over the remaining family members, who mostly avoided eye contact, "let us continue with the final distributions." His words tried to force a return to normalcy, but the air still thrummed with the absence of Clara, a gaping wound in the family's fabric. I returned to my armchair, but the plush velvet offered no comfort, only the lingering imprint of Clara's recent presence beside me. My mind, however, refused to follow Mr. Henderson's measured tones. It kept replaying Clara's face, that ghastly pallor, the way her eyes had looked at me as if I were a stranger. Every now and then I'd catch a cousin's fleeting glance, quickly averted, and I could almost hear the questions forming in their minds. Why him? What did Oliver do? It wasn't fair, this inherited guilt. I had wanted none of this, yet here I was, shackled to a future I hadn't chosen, watching my sister's dreams crumble before me. The Seattle rain outside intensified, a drum solo accompanying my internal turmoil. And to the Seattle Children's Hospital, a donation of $5 million in shares, Mr. Henderson recited, his voice unwavering, as if discussing the weather. Aunt Beatrice sniffled softly, reaching for a tissue from her purse, her eyes still red-rimmed from earlier tears, perhaps now renewed by a different kind of sorrow. Uncle Thomas shifted, crossing and uncrossing his legs, a nervous energy radiating from him. The room felt stifling, the very air thick with unspoken history and fractured relationships. I focused on a faint smudge on the mahogany desk, anything to avoid the uncomfortable scrutiny. Then Mr. Henderson looked up, directly at me again. "Oliver, your father also left a sealed letter addressed specifically to you. He instructed me to give it to you personally, and only after the full reading of the will." He reached into the main folder, pulling out a thick, cream-colored envelope. My name, in Dad's familiar bold script, was scrawled across the front. A letter. My stomach clenched. What secrets could it hold? Was this Dad's explanation for his inexplicable decision? A sudden, urgent desire to rip it open, to find answers, warred with a deep sense of dread. "A letter?" Aunt Beatrice murmured, her voice laced with curiosity. Uncle Thomas leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the envelope. Mr. Henderson simply handed it to me, his touch brief, professional. The paper felt heavy in my hand, surprisingly warm, as if still retaining some of Dad's presence. I tucked it into my inner jacket pocket, the weight of it a constant, unsettling reminder. It felt like a ticking time bomb, holding the key to a truth I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover, a truth that might further alienate me from Clara. Mr. Henderson smoothly transitioned to the final provisions, his monotone voice filling the uncomfortable silence. He spoke of minor trusts for distant relatives and the specific burial instructions for Dad's remains. Each clause felt more like a formality, a quiet winding down of an incredibly tense act. The family, still reeling, offered little more than monosyllabic acknowledgments. I barely registered the details, my mind consumed by the letter in my pocket and the ghost of Clara's stunned face. "So, that concludes the reading of the last will and testament of Reginald Henderson," Mr. Henderson stated, finally closing the folder with a decisive snap. The sound echoed in the quiet room, a final chilling period to the most seismic event of my life. I will be available for any questions or to discuss the next steps regarding the transition of Henderson Industries, Oliver. His words were direct, almost a command. The weight of the company, the sheer scale of the responsibility, suddenly pressed down on me with renewed force, a physical ache. Uncle Thomas stood up, stretching his back. "Well, I suppose that's that then." His voice was tinged with a weariness that went beyond grief, a resignation to a new, unsettling reality. Aunt Beatrice rose as well, her gaze resting on me, still filled with that complex mix of pity and concern. "We should probably let Oliver gather his thoughts," she suggested gently, nodding towards the door. The family began to disperse, murmuring their goodbyes, the previous atmosphere of warmth and shared mourning replaced by an awkward, almost hurried retreat. I was left alone in the study, the heavy oak door swinging shut behind the last departing relative, the silence louder than ever. The silence, once a mere absence of sound, now resonated with the ghosts of questions, of Clara's shattered expectations, and my own bewildering inheritance. I stood by the bay window, the relentless Seattle rain a backdrop to the tumultuous downpour inside me. My fingers instinctively went to my jacket pocket, where the cream-colored envelope, addressed in Dad's firm hand, rested like a hot coal. It pulsed with an unread truth, a final whisper from the man who had just dismantled my sister's future and shackled me to his legacy. The study, once a place of comfort and shared family moments, now felt like an interrogation room, the antique furniture bearing silent witness to the unraveling. Each tick of the grandfather clock in the corner felt amplified, dragging out the seconds, each beat a stark reminder of Dad's deliberate, calculated decision. Why me? The question hammered against the inside of my skull. Clara, my sister, had lived and breathed Henderson Industries. From childhood, she'd spent summers shadowing Dad, learning the ropes, her enthusiasm for the business infectious. She possessed the charisma, the ruthless strategic mind, the sheer drive that I lacked. My own path, quietly navigating the world of financial analytics, was a stark contrast to the grand, public-facing empire Dad had built. I preferred numbers to people, solitude to boardrooms. This wasn't just a change of career. It was an amputation of my very nature. I pulled the letter out, the paper crisp under my trembling fingers. Dad's handwriting was so familiar, yet in this context, it felt alien, loaded with a meaning I couldn't yet grasp. I turned it over, tracing the faint impression of his seal, a small, intricate H. A wave of sorrow, raw and unexpected, washed over me, not just for his loss, but for the fracturing of my family, a collateral damage I felt wholly responsible for. "Dad," I murmured, the word barely a breath. "What did you do?" The rain outside continued its steady drumming, a monotonous, relentless rhythm against the glass, mirroring the dull ache in my chest. A sudden sharp memory surfaced. Dad, years ago, watching Clara give an impromptu, passionate speech about expanding the company's manufacturing overseas. He'd beamed, a proud, almost proprietary smile. Then he'd looked at me, sitting quietly with a book, a faint, unreadable expression in his eyes. Was it disappointment? Understanding? I had always assumed it was the former, a quiet acceptance that I was simply not cut from the same cloth. Now that memory twisted, becoming an insidious question mark over everything I thought I knew about his expectations for us, for me. My gaze fell upon a framed photograph on the mantelpiece, Dad and Clara arm in arm, laughing, taken at some company gala. They looked like partners, a true succession. I wasn't in the picture, and now I was the one left holding the reins. The unfairness of it all, not just to Clara, but to me, began to fester. The burden felt suffocating, a crown that was too heavy and too sharp, digging into my scalp. The weight of thousands of employees, of intricate supply chains, of a legacy I never asked for, pressed down on me. I wanted to scream, to throw the letter into the crackling fireplace, to reject this unwanted destiny, but a deeper, more primal urge compelled me to find an answer, a reason that might justify this incomprehensible act. I needed to understand. I needed to understand for Clara's sake and perhaps even more desperately for my own. The envelope felt lighter now, no longer a bomb, but a key. My thumb found the flap, tearing it open slowly, the soft ripping sound a stark punctuation mark in the profound quiet. I pulled out the folded sheet of paper, the elegant script of Dad's familiar penmanship filling the page. The first line stared back at me, a direct gaze from beyond the grave. "Oliver, my boy," it began, his voice, or rather the echo of it, immediately in my mind. The casual opening, so typical of him, felt incongruous with the magnitude of the moment, the devastation it had wrought. My eyes scanned the words, searching for an explanation, a reprieve, a secret clause that would make sense of this madness. The paper was slightly creased, as if Dad had held it often, contemplating these very words, these very repercussions. I could almost smell his pipe tobacco, feel the warmth of his hand on my shoulder as I continued to read, each word pulling me deeper into his final, perplexing confession. The crisp paper felt alive in my hands, holding not just words, but a final, intimate conversation. "Oliver, my boy," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and the will has been read. I know what you're thinking, and I know what Clara is feeling." My breath hitched. He knew. He anticipated the chaos. A cold wave washed over me, a strange mix of dread and a desperate hope for clarity. Dad wasn't unaware of the storm. He had chosen to brave it. "Clara," the letter continued, "is a force of nature, charismatic, driven, a true leader, with passion for this company running in her veins. That is a tremendous asset. But the world, Oliver, is changing. Henderson Industries cannot survive on charm and passion alone anymore." My eyes skimmed these lines, acknowledging familiar truths, then snagged on the stark pivot. This was it, the reason, the answer to the why. "We need prudence," Dad's words shifted, a tone of foresight. "We need a steady hand that isn't swayed by public opinion or the immediate thrill of the deal. Your quiet, analytical mind, Oliver, the one you always thought I overlooked, is precisely what Henderson Industries needs for its next 50 years. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, a stunning reversal of every perceived weakness. He had seen me, truly seen me, even when I thought he hadn't. It was a quiet validation, profound and utterly shattering. "I know this will hurt her deeply," Dad wrote, his penmanship slightly heavier, "and it breaks my heart to cause her pain. But for the company, for the thousands of families whose livelihoods depend on it, I had to choose the steadiest hand. The trust fund, the properties, those are not consolation prizes, Oliver. They are the security she deserves, freed from the immense pressures of leadership that I knew, deep down, would eventually consume her joyful spirit. I wanted her to be free, not burdened." The study, once an echo chamber of grief, now felt charged with Dad's presence, his quiet, devastating logic. He hadn't disinherited Clara out of malice, but out of a painful paternal love, protecting her from a future he believed would diminish her. He saw her fragility beneath the bravado, a vulnerability I had never acknowledged. My initial anger, the feeling of an unfair burden, began to recede, replaced by a profound understanding and a new, heavier responsibility. This was not just about money or power. It was about Dad's legacy of care, however brutally delivered. The Seattle rain outside seemed to soften, its drumming now a low, mournful hum against the window pane. I reread the last paragraph, the words blurring slightly through a sudden sheen in my eyes. Dad hadn't chosen me because I was better, but because he believed I was different, suited for a challenge he foresaw. His decision was a testament to his understanding of our individual natures, a final, painful act of love and protection. The weight on my shoulders didn't lessen, but it transformed, from a crushing burden into a sacred trust. I folded the letter slowly, carefully, tucking it back into my pocket, closer to my heart. The silence in the room was no longer oppressive. It was contemplative, filled with the echoes of a father's final, complex wisdom. The cold dread in my chest thawed, replaced by an even colder, yet clearer purpose. Dad's letter wasn't just a justification, it was a map, etched with his final, desperate hope for Henderson Industries and for us. I saw the study anew, not as a place of silent judgment, but as a space imbued with his complex, almost tragic love. The antique furniture, heavy curtains, the scent of old paper and leather, they were silent witnesses to a legacy now understood, not merely inherited. My gaze drifted to the bay window. The Seattle rain had softened to a gentle patter, no longer a drumming accusation, but a quiet murmur. It felt as if the world outside had shifted, aligning with this profound realization. Clara, my sister. Her name still twisted in my gut, a sharp, undeniable pain. He had protected her at the cost of her immediate happiness, and perhaps our bond. How could I ever make her see this paternal love that manifested as such a profound public wound? I walked to Dad's grand desk, running my hand over its smooth, polished surface. It felt solid, enduring. Like the company, like the chasm between Clara and me. This wasn't just about buildings and numbers. It was thousands of lives resting on my shoulders. I, Oliver Henderson, the quiet observer, who preferred solitude to boardrooms, was now at the helm. It felt both ludicrous and terrifying. Closing my eyes, I pictured her vibrant, laughing self, the Clara who'd shared secrets, who'd been my fierce protector. Could that Clara ever return? Could we find our way back to being siblings, not rivals in the shadow of a father's will? The question hung in the expectant silence. The immediate shock faded, replaced by the daunting reality ahead. I had a company to run, a legacy to uphold, and, most pressingly, a sister to someday, somehow, reconnect with. Dad's last act had been a gamble, a painful one, on me. On his belief in a quiet strength he saw beneath my detached exterior. It was a trust I couldn't betray. The study's grand clock chimed softly, marking time's passage, the end of one chapter and the daunting beginning of another. I inhaled deeply, the faint scent of old wood and Dad's cologne filling my lungs, now carrying the heavy aroma of responsibility. My name, Oliver, echoed in my mind, no longer just a label, but a title, both burdened and blessed. I knew the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, with resistance, especially from Clara. But armed with Dad's letter, with his final, profound revelation, I felt a flicker of resolve. Not the triumphant fire Clara possessed, but a steady, quiet ember, fueled by duty and a burgeoning, unexpected sense of purpose. The world outside, a muted gray under the continuing drizzle, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for me to step into the vast, unknown expanse of Henderson Industries, a solitary figure navigating a legacy both immense and deeply personal.